Chapter 28 of Wanderer of the Wasteland by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. The foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, cried Adam. Was it he who lay there with aching heart and burning eyes? Ah, again the lonely wasteland claimed him. That illimitable desert was home. Whose face was that limned on the clouds and set into the beaten mossy mosaic of the sands, and sculptured in the contour of the dim, colored ranges? His burrows nipped the sage behind him as he lay, back against a stone, on the lofty height of the Sierra Madre divide, gazing down into that boundless void. What was it that had happened? Ah, he had fled. And he lived over again for the 1000th time that week, that fleeting week of transport with its endless regrets, in which he had found Jeannie a home, in which the daughter of Magdalene Virey had stormed his soul. Vague and happy those first days when he bought the valley lands and flooded them with cattle, vague because of the slow gathering of insupportable and unconscious love, happy because he lived with Jeannie's rapture and her romance. Vivid were some of the memories, when he placed in Jeannie's little brown hands papers and deeds and bank books, and by a gesture, as if by magic, proclaimed to her wondering sense the truth of a tale of Aladdin. When, to the serious-faced mother, pondering the costs, he announced her once more owner of the long-regretted land, when, to a fire-eyed lad, he had drawn aside the veil of the future. But vague, mystic as a troubled dream, the inception of a love that rose like the blaze of the sun, vague as the opaque dawn of the desert. Whenever he looked up, by night or day, at task or idleness, there shone the lovely face, pale as a dawn-hazed star, a face like Magdalene Virey's, with all of its beauty, but not of its passion, with all of its charm, yet none of its havoc, with youth and bloom, and wide-open purple eyes, dark as midnight, staring at fate, and a voice like the voice of her mother, sweet but not mocking, haunted the dreams of the man and lived in the winds. "And you are a desert man," she had said. "Yes, a desert man," he had replied. "There's a place I want to go some day, when I am 21. Death Valley. Do you know it? My grandfather says I'm mad. Death Valley. For such as you? Stay, never go near that awful hell. The ghastly white pit and its naked red walls, the midnight furnace winds with their wailing roar, the long, long slopes to the avalanche graves. Ah, the torment of his heart, the tragedy he would hide, and the secret he must keep, and the miniature that burned in its place. They drew her with the invisible cords of life and fate. What he would spare her surged in the air that she breathed. She had come to him under the oaks, and yet again, quitting her friends, drawn to the lonely desert man. "They told me Jeannie's story," she said, and her eyes spoke eloquent praise her lips denied. "And so, her mother and father died on the desert. Tell me, desert man, what does Death Valley look like?" "It is night, it is hell, death and desolation, the grave of the desert, yellow and red and gray, lonely, 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 silent land. But you love it. Jeannie says the Indians call you Eagle, because you have the eye of the eagle. Tell me, tell me." And she made him talk, and she came again. Vague, sweet first hours they were, with their drawing pain. Was it well to wake in the night, with eyes darker than the darkness peering into his soul? Her mother's eyes, with all the glory and none of the shame. She had come another day and then the next, while time stood still with its mocking wait. Not vaguely came a scene. I will tell you of the desert, and a part of his story followed, brief and hard. "Ah, I would be a man," she said. "I would never run, I would never hide." Mocking words from a tongue too sweet to mock. She had her mother's spirit. and Adam groped in the gloom to the glee of his devils of scorn. The grass by day and the grass by night felt the impress of his face. Then love, first real love of youth, and noble passion of man, blazed as the sun in his face. From that revelation all was clear in the bursting light of calamity. Ruth was coming under the oaks. She liked the cool shade and hated the glare. She was 19, with a woman's form and her mother's eyes, proud, sweet, aloof. "Desert man, I am lonesome," she said. "My grandfather has gone again. He is chasing some new will-o'-the-wisp. Gold and mines, cattle and land, and now it's water. He has an ear for every man." "Lonesome? You? What do you know of loneliness?" asked Adam. "There's a loneliness of soul." "Ah, but you are young. Go help Jeanie plan her home." Jeanie and Jean, two people with but one voice. They cannot hear or see anyone but themselves. It's a pity to invade their paradise. I will not. And oh, how beautiful the world must be to them. Ruth, is it not so to you? "Beautiful lands and greens and waters," she exclaimed in restless discontent. "But I cannot live on scenery. There is joy here, but none for me. I lost my mother, and I can't forget. She had to leave me to go with him, my father. My father who loved me as a child and hated me as a girl. Oh, it's all a mystery. She went with him to the desert. Gold mad, she said he was. She had her debt to pay, and I could not be taken to Death Valley. You have never heard from her since the parting?" "Never. And I am a woman now. Some day I will go to Death Valley." "Why?" he asked. "Because they went there." "But no one lives long in that valley of death." "Then I will find their graves," she said. "Ruth, you must not. What good can come of your traveling there? I've told you of its desolate and forbidding nature. You are all wrong. Wait, perhaps your mother will. Perhaps you will hear of her some day." "Oh, desert man, I was a child when we parted. I'm a woman now. I want to know. The mystery haunts me. She loved me, so well. Sometimes I cannot bear to live. My grandfather hides me in lonely places. We meet but few people, and those he repels. It's because of me, desert man. I am lonelier than was Jeanie. She is like a bird. She must have lived on the sun and the winds. But I am no child, and I am forlorn." Brooding purple eyes of trouble, of longing, of discontent, of fire for life. The heart and soul of Ruth Virey, the heritage of need and unrest, shone from her eyes. All unconsciously she longed to be loved. She stood on the threshold of womanhood like a leaf in a storm. "Talk with me, walk with me, desert man," she said wistfully. "You were tagwitch for Jeanie. Be eagle for me. Your eyes know the desert where my mother sleeps, where perhaps her spirit wanders. You soothe my troubled heart. Oh, I can feel myself with you, for you understand." Thus Adam's soul was stormed. Magdalene Virey had presaged the future. In the dark stillness of the night, sleepless, haunted, tossed by torment, it was revealed to him that Magdalene Virey had risen out of the depths on noble love for him, and through that love she had seen with mystic eyes into the future. She had projected that love into the spirit of the desert, and it had guided Adam's wandering steps to her daughter Ruth. Was this only a wanderer's dream as he lay on the hills? Was it only a knot in the tangled skein of his desert life? Was it inscrutable design of a power he disdained? Be what this might, the one great love of his years possessed him, fierce and resistless on its march to his defeat. It mocked his ordeal. It flaunted a banner in his face. Noble love, noble passion, love of the soul, all that revered woman, wife, mother, and babe. He had found his mate. Strange how he remembered Margarita Arianas and the wild boy's love of a day. Poor, pale, wasteful, sinful, lustful little gleam. And he recalled the spell of Jeannie, that strong call of nature in the wilderness. Above both he had arisen. But Ruth Varey was the woman. He could win her. The truth beat at his temples, constricted his throat. Ruth was the flower of her mother's tragic longing to be loved. Ruth burned with that longing, and life was not to be denied. Magdalene Varey had given him this child of her agony. She trusted the fate of Ruth in his hands. She saw with superhuman eyes. A deep tenderness for Ruth pervaded Adam's soul. Who of all men could love her, save her, content her as he? It was not thought of her kisses, of her embraces, that plucked at the roots of his will. Like a passing wave, the thrill of such bliss went out to the mind of a nobler tide. To save Ruth from the fate of her mother, from the peril of her own heart. And in the saving, a home, happiness, the tender smile of a mother, and the kiss of a child. But I am a criminal. I am a murderer. Any day I might be hanged before her very eyes, he whispered, with his face in the grass, his fingers digging the turf. Still, no one would ever recognize me now. Ah, but he, that human wolf Kalisha, would not he know me? Oh, if there be God, help me in my extremity. Once again he met her. As he rode up the valley at sunset, she came out of the oak grove. I've been with Jeannie. Desert man, her happiness frightens me. Oh, I love her. You tell me of your hard, lonely, terrible desert life. Why, your ears should ring with bells of joy forever. It is you who have built her castle. What other deeds like that have you done, in those bitter years you tell of? Not many, Ruth, perhaps not one. I don't believe you. I am learning you, desert man, and oh, I wish you knew how it swells my heart to hear Jeannie tell of what you did for her. Every day she tells me something new. Ah, and more, for today she said you would be leaving soon. Yes, Ruth, soon, he said. Back to the lonely land? Yes, back to the sage and sand and the big dark hills. Yes, it will be a lonely land, he replied sadly. And you will wander down the trails until you meet someone, some woman or child or man, sick or miserable or lost, and then you will stop. Adam had no answer. The Indians called you Eagle, she went on, and her tone startled him with its hint of remembered mockery. You have the desert eye. You see so far, but you don't see here. Why should you waste your splendid strength, your magnificent manhood, wandering over the desert if it's only for unhappy people? Desert man, you are great. But you could do more good here. You could find more misery here. I know one whose heart is breaking, and you've never seen, for all your eagle eye. Listen, you morbid girl, he returned, stung as with fire. I am not great. I am lost. I go to the desert because it is home. Don't think of me, but look to yourself. Look into your heart. Fear it, Ruth Varey. You are a spoiled, dreamful, passionate child. But you have a mind and you have a will. You can conquer your unrest, your discontent. Revere the memory of your mother, but grieve no more. The past is dead. Learn to fight. You are no fighter. You are weak. You give in to loneliness, sadness, longing. Resolve to be a woman. You must live your life. Make it worthwhile. Every man, every woman has a burden. Lift yours cheerfully and begin to climb. Work for your grandfather. He needs your help. Love those with whom fate has placed you, and fight the dark moods, the selfish thoughts, the hateful memories. Fight like a desert beast for your life. Work, work till you bruise those beautiful hands. Work with a hoe, if you can find nothing else. Love to see things grow green and flower and give fruit. Love the animals, the birds, and learn from them. Love all nature, so that when you meet a man some day, the man, you can love him. That is what it means to be a woman. You are a beautiful, sweet, useless, and petulant girl. But be so no more. Be a woman. Pale and shocked, with brimming eyes and tremulous lips, she replied, "Stay, stay, desert man, and make me a woman." And those sad dark eyes and those sweet murmured words had made him flee like a craven in the night. Yes, for Ruth's sake he had fled. Not a farewell to Jeanie, not a wave of his hand, but gone in the night, gone forever out of their lives. "The foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests," cried Adam to the listening silence. Was it he who lay there with broken heart and magnified sight? Yes, wanderer of the wasteland again. Back to the lonely land. That limitless expanse of rock and sand was home. Was not that Ruth's face limned in the clouds? Did not her sad, reproachful eyes haunt him in the dim, purple distances? From the lofty divide of the Sierra Madres Adam gazed down into the void he called home. Beyond the gray sands and far beyond the red reaches he saw across the California desert into Arizona, and down into Mexico, and to the dim blue Gulf. Home. All the years of Adam's desert experience were needed to grasp the meaning of the stupendous scene. The eye of the eagle, the sight of the condor, supreme over the desert, most marvelous and delicate work of nature, could only behold, could only range that sun-blasted, burned-out empire of the wastelands. Only the mind of man, the thought of man, could understand it. And for Adam it was home, and to his piercing eyes a thing, a place, a world, terribly true and beautiful and comforting, upon which he seemed driven to gaze and gaze, so that forever it must be limned on his vision and his memory. The day was one of sunlight and storm, of blue sky and purple clouds and fleecy white, of palls of swirling gray snow and dark veils of downward streaming rain. The Sierra Madres rolled away on either side, range on range, rising to the north in the mind of slow, league-long mountain swell, until far against the stormy sky stood the old white captive of San Gorgonio looming over the gray Mojave, and to the south, like the wave undulations of calm sea, sank the long low lines of the arid arm of desert land. Beneath Adam piled the foothills, round and old and gray, sage-gray, lavender-gray, lilac-gray, also strangely gray, upheaved hills of aged earth and dust and stone. Hill by hill they lowered, with glaring gorges between, solitary hills and winding ranges and clustered domes, split by canyons and cleft by brushy ravines. Miles and miles of foothills, reluctantly surrendering allegiance to the peaks above, moving downward as surely as the grains of their slopes, weathering and spreading at last in the sands. Away and away flowed that gray Sahara with its specks of sage, ribbed by its ridges of dunes. Immense and unbounded it swept to its center, the Salton Sink, bowl of the desert, a great lake of colored silt, a ghastly, glaring stain on the earth, over which the storm clouds trailed their veils of rain, and shadows like colossal ships sailed the sandy main. Away to the southward it flowed, level and shining, at last to rise and meet the blue sky in lucent spurs of gold and white. This landmark contrasted singularly with the Salton Sink. It was the elusive and shifting line of the Superstition Mountains, where the wind sheeted the sands, by night or day, like the changing of tides, went on with its mysterious transformation. These giant sandhills caught the sunlight through a rift in the broken clouds, and dim under the dune showed the scalloped dark shadows. But these foothills and sand plains were only the edge of the desert. Beyond marched the mountain ranges, vast, upheaved, crinkled crust of the naked earth, scorched by fire, scarred by age, cracked by earthquake, and stained in the rusty reds and colored chocolates of the iron rocks. Down to the rim of the Salton Sink sheered a ragged range. Over it centered the lowering storm clouds, gray and drab and purple, with rays of sun filtering through, lighting the grim, dark hardness, showing the smoky gloom. And where the ridge ran down to the desert, to make the lines of the sandy lake, it resembled the shore of the river Styx. Beyond gleamed the chocolate mountains, sharp in the sunshine, canyoned and blue. And still beyond them, over the valley and far, rose the myriad mountains of Arizona, dim, hazed land, mystic land, like a land of desert dreams. In the distant south, around the blunt end of the chocolates, came a valley winding palely green, with a line following its center, where the Rio Colorado meandered in its course to the blue waters of the Gulf. Over the shadowy shapes of mountains in haze, over the horizon of Arizona, there seemed a blank, pale wall of sky, strange to the eye. Was it the oblivion of sight, the infinitude of heaven? Piercing constant gaze at last brought to Adam the ghostly mountains of Mexico, the faintest of faint tracery of peaks, doubtful, then lost, the lonely Sonorian land. "And that is my home," he cried to the winds. Slow tears bathed his eyes, and closing them, he rested his strained sight. A strange peace seemed to have stolen over him with his vision and grasp of the desert. A low, soft moan of wind in the crevices of rocks lulled his senses for the revel that was to come. He heard his burros nipping at the brush behind his back. From the heights an eagle shrilled its wild whistle of freedom and of solitude. One of the burros brayed, loud and bawling, a jarring note in a silence. Discordant sound it was, that yet brought a smile and a pang to Adam. For only yesterday, or was it long ago, what was it that had happened? When he opened his eyes, the desert under him and the infinity over him had been transfigured. Only the full blaze of the sun. But what a glory dwelt in the clouds and in the wide blue expanse of heaven. Silver-edged rents, purple ships in a golden sky, the long, fan-shaped rays of the sun, white rainbows of haze, these extended from the north across the arch to the open, a great peacefulness of light, deep and tender and blue. Beneath lay the mirror of earth, the sun-fired ranges like chased and beaten gold, laid with shining jewels all around the resplendent desert. Mountains of porphyry marched down to the sands, rocks of bronze red burned down to the sands. The white columnar pillars of the clouds seemed reflected in the desert, slow gliding across the lucent wastes, and the mosaic of mountain and plain had its mirage in the sky. Above and below worked the alchemy of nature, mutable and evanescent, the dying of day, the passing of life. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Wanderer of the Wasteland by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Going down into the desert, Adam found that his footsteps were no longer wandering and aimless. And the nearer he got to the canyon pass in the chocolates, the stronger grew his strange eagerness. For years, memory of that camp where he had fought starvation had drawn him like a magnet. He was weary with delving into the gulf of himself, trying to know his nature and heart and soul. Always he was beyond himself. No sooner was one mystery solved than another and deeper one presented itself. One victory gained, then a more desperate trial faced him. He only knew the old camp called him resistlessly. Something would come to him there. Travel and tasks of morn and eve were so habitual with him that they made little break in his thought. And that thought, like his desert steps, had traveled in a circle. He was nearing the places where he had begun his fight with physical forces. His every step brought him so much closer to the terrible deed that had so bitterly colored and directed his desert life. He crossed the sandy basin from the Sierra Madres to the Chocolates in 4 days, 2 of his camps being dry. And on the 5th, in the afternoon, when the long shadows had begun to creep out from the mountains across sand and sage, he climbed the swelling, well-remembered slope where Charlie Jim had lured the antelope, and gazed down into the oasis where he had all but starved to death, and where Oela had saved his life. What struck him with gladness was to find the gray-green, lonely scene identical with the picture in his memory. How well he remembered! And it was 12 years, 13, 14 years. Yet time had made little or no change in the oasis. Nature worked slowly in the desert. His burros scented the water and trotted down the sage bank, bobbing their packs, kicking up little puffs of odorous dust. Adam stood still and gazed long. He seemed to be almost ready to draw a deep, full breath of melancholy joy. Then he descended to the sandy, rock-studded floor of the canyon, and on the wide white stream bed, where, as always, a slender stream tinkled over the pearly pebbles. How strange that he should fall into the exact course where once he had worn a trail. The flat stones upon which he stepped were as familiar as if he had trod them yesterday. But inside the palm grove time had made changes. The thatched huts were gone and the open places were overgrown with brush. No one had inhabited the oasis for many years. Leisurely he pitched camp, working with a sense of comfort and pleasure at the anticipation of a permanent, or at least an indefinite, stay there. Of all his lonely camps on the desert, this had been the loneliest. He called it Lost Oasis. Here he could spend days and weeks, basking like a lizard in the sunshine, feeling his loneliness, listening to the silence, and he would climb to the heights and dream, and watch, and live again those wonderful, revealing, unthinking moments when he went back to savage nature. After his work and meal were finished, and sunset was coloring the sky, Adam wandered around through the willows and along the stream. He stood for some time looking down upon the sandy bar where he had stumbled in pursuit of the rattlesnake and it had bitten him in the face. And then he went from one familiar place to another, sitting at last in the twilight, under the palms where Oela had nursed and fed him back to life and strength. Where was she now, that tranquil, somber-eyed Indian maiden who had refused to wed one of her race and who had died of a broken heart? The twilight seemed prophetic. The rustling palms seemed whispering. Both sadness and pleasure mingled in Adam's return. But the nameless something, the vague assurance of content, the end of that restless, strange sense of hurrying onward still to seek, to find, these feelings seemed about to come to him, yet held tantalizingly aloof. Tomorrow, surely. He was tired with his long travel, and it would take a little time once more to adjust himself to loneliness. The perfect peace of loneliness had not yet come back to him. His mind was too full to attend to the scene, listening, feeling that constituted harmony with the desert. Yet something was beginning to come between remembrances of the immediate past and the insistent premonitions of the present. When he lay down in his blankets to hear the low rustle of the wind in the palms and to see the haunting stars, it was to realize that they were the same as always, but that he himself had changed. Next day he climbed to the heights where he had learned to hunt mountain sheep, where he had learned the watching, listening, primitive joy of the Indian. He thrilled in the climb. He breathed deep of the keen, cold wind. He gazed afar with piercing eyes. Hours, like those of a lonely eagle on a crag, Adam spent there, and he wooed back to him the watching, listening power with its reward of sweet, wild elation. But as the westering sun sent him down the mountain, he felt a vague regret. The indefinable something eluded him. In the dusk, Adam walked along the rim of the slope above the oasis. He had watched the sunset fade over the desert, and the shading of twilight, and the gathering of dusk. He wondered what it would mean to him now to be lost without water or food down there in the wasteland. Would panic seize him? He imagined it would be only as long as he was not sure of death. When he realized that, he would find strength and peace to meet his doom. But what agony to look up at the starlit heaven and breathe farewell to beautiful life, to the strong, sweet wine of nature, to the memory of love. To die alone down there? Ah, why did his thoughts turn to death? To lie down on the sand and the sage of the desert, in the dead darkness of night, would be terrible. Yet, would it really be? Would not something come to his soul? A strong man's farewell to life, out there on the lonesome desert, would be elemental and natural. But the hour of facing death, how sad, lonely, tragic. Yet it had been bravely met by countless men all over the desolate deserts of the dreary world. All men did not feel alike. Perhaps the strongest, bravest, calmest would suffer the least. Still, it was Adam's conviction that to look up at the indifferent heavens and to send a hopeless cry out across the desert, realizing the end, remembering with anguish the faces of loved ones, would indeed be a bursting of the heart. Life was so short, hope and love so futile. Home and family, a brother, should be treasured and lived for with all the power of blood and mind. Friends should be precious. It was realization that man needed. A crescent beautiful moon soared up over the dark bulk of the mountain. Adam paced to and fro in a sandy glade of the oasis. All the immensity of desert and infinity of sky seemed to be at work to overwhelm him. The stars, so white, wonderful, watching, eyes of heaven, remorseless and wise. Not a sigh of wind stirred under the palms, not a quiver of a leaf. Nature seemed so strange, beautiful, waiting. All waited. Was it for him? The shadows on the white sand wrote Adam's story of wild youth and crime, and flight and agony, and passion and love. How sad the low chirp of insects! Adam paced there a long time, thinking thoughts he never had before, feeling things he never felt before, realizing the brevity of life, the soul of sorrow, the truth of nature, the sweetness of women, the glory of children, the happiness of work and home. Something was charging the air around Adam. Something was surging deep in his soul. What was the meaning of that which confounded his emotions? Adam's soul seemed trembling on the verge of a great lesson that had been hidden all the years and now began to dawn upon him in the glory of the firmament, in the immensity of the earth, in the sense of endless space, in the meaning of time, in the nothingness of man. Suddenly a faint coldness, not of wind nor of chill air, but of something intangible, stole over Adam. He shivered. He had felt it before, though never so strong. And his sense of loneliness vanished. He was not alone. All around he peered, not frightened or aghast, but uncertain, vaguely conscious of a sense that seemed unnatural. The shadow of his lofty form showed dark on the sand. It walked with him as he walked. Was there a spirit in keeping with his steps? Disturbed in mind, Adam went to bed. When he awoke, there had come to him in the night, in his sleep or in his dreams, whispered words from Jeannie's mother, ringing words from Ruth Virey. I will come to you out on the desert. Mrs. Linwood had meant that to be proof of immortal life of the soul, of God. And Ruth had rung at him. I would be a man. I would never run. I would never hide. Then the still, small voice of conscience became a clarion. Torment seized Adam. The lonely lure of the desert had betrayed him. There was no rest, no peace. He was driven. He had dreamed of himself as a wanderer driven down the naked shingles of the desert. No dream, but reality. He spent the day upon the heights, feeling that there, if anywhere, he might shake this burden of his consciousness. In vain. He was a civilized man, and only in rare moments could he go back to the forgetfulness of the savage. He had a soul. It was a living flame. The heights failed him. A haunting whisper breathed in the wind, and an invisible spirit kept pace with his steps. And at last, in slow mounting swell of heart, with terror in his soul, he faced the south. Ah, how sharp the pang in his breast! Picacho! There, purple against the sky, seemingly close, stood up the turreted and castled peak under the shadow of which lay the grave of his brother. And Adam sent out a lonely and terrible cry down the winds toward the place that resistlessly called him. He was called, and he must go. He had wandered in a circle. All his steps had been bent toward the scene of his crime. From the first to the last he had been wandering back to his punishment. He saw it now. That was the call, that the guide, that the nameless something charging the air. Realization gave him a moment's savageness, the power of body over mind. Heart and blood and pulse and nerve burst red-hot to the fight, and to the passionate love of liberty, of life. He was in the grasp of a giant of the ages. He fought as he had fought thirst, starvation, loneliness, as he had fought the desert and the wild beasts and wilder men of that desert. The deep and powerful instinct which he had conquered for Jeannie's sake, the noble emotion of love and bliss that he had overcome for Ruth's sake, what were these compared to the hell in his heart now? It was love of life that made him a fierce wildcat of the desert. Had not the desert taught him its secret to survive, to breathe, to see, to listen, to live? Thus the I of Adam's soul was arraigned in pitiless strife with the me of his body. Like a wild and hunted creature he roamed the mountain top, halting at the old resting places, there to sit like a stone, to lie on his face, to writhe and fight and cry in his torment. At sunset he staggered down the trail, spent and haggard, to take up useless tasks, to find food tasteless and sleep impossible. Thus passed the next day and yet another, before there came a break in his passion and his strength. The violence of physical effort wore itself out. He remained in camp, still locked in a deadly grip with himself, but wearing to that end in which his conscience would rise supreme, or he would sink forever debased. A perfect white night came in which Adam felt that the oasis and its environment presented a soul-quieting scene. What incredible paradox that he must go to nature for the strength to save himself from himself, to the nature that made him a savage, that urged him in the strife of the wolf. The moon, half full, shone overhead in a cloudless blue sky where great white stars twinkled. No wind stirred. The palms drooped, sad and graceful, strangely quiet. They were meant for wind. The shadows they cast were of nameless shapes. A wavering dark line of horizon wandered away to be lost in the wilderness. So still, so tranquil, so sweet the night! There were only two sounds, the melancholy notes of a nighthawk, and the low, faint moan from the desert. The desert to Adam seemed a vast river, flowing slowly down the levels of the earth to distant gates. Its moan was one of immutable power and motive. By this soft, low, strange moan the world seemed to be dominated. A spirit was out there in the gloom, a spirit from the illimitable, star-studded infinite above. And it was this spirit that came, at rare intervals, and whispered to Adam's consciousness. Madman or knave, he was being conquered. "I would never hide," Ruth Virey had said in passionate scorn. She was like her mother, wonderful as steel in her will. Yet these women seemed all heart. They transcended men in love, in sacrifice, in that living flame of soul, turbulent and unquenchable as the fire of the sun. "I'll hide no more," burst from Adam, and the whisper startled him, like those soundless whispers in the shadows. He could live no longer a life in hiding. He must stand, in his own consciousness, if only for a moment, free to look any man in the face, free to be worthy to love Ruth Virey, free as the eagle of his spirit. He would no longer hide from man, from punishment. Love of that purple-eyed girl had been a stinging, quickening spur, but it was only instrumental in the overthrow of fear. Some other power, not physical, not love, but cold, pure, passionless, spiritual, had been drawing him like a wavering compass needle to its pole. Was it the faith Jeannie's dying mother had placed in God? Was it a godlike something in him which conflicted with nature? Was it the strange progress of life, inscrutable and inflexible, that dragged men down or lifted them up, made them base or made them great? The darkness of his mind, the blackness of the abyss of his soul, seemed about to be illumined. But the truth held aloof. Yet could he not see what constituted greatness in any man? What was it to be great? The beasts of the desert and the birds recognized it. Strength, speed, ferocity, tenacity of life. The Indians worshipped greatness so that they looked up and prayed to their gods. They worshipped stature, and power and skill of hand, and fleetness of foot, and above all, endurance. More, they endowed their great chieftains with wisdom. But above all, to endure pain, heat, shock, all of the desert hardships, all of the agonies of life, to endure, that was their symbol of greatness. Adam asked no other for himself or for any man. To endure and to surmount the ills of life. Any man could be great. He had his choice. To realize at last, to face the inevitable fight in any walk of life, to work and to endure, to slave and to suffer in silence, to stand like a savage the bloody bruises and broken bones, to bite the tongue and hold back the gasp, to plod on down the trails or the roads or the streets and to be true to an ideal, to endure the stings and blows of misfortune, to bear up under loss, to fight the bitterness of defeat and the weakness of grief, to be victor over anger, to smile when tears were close, to resist disease and evil men and base instincts, to hate hate and to love love, to go on when it would seem good to die, to seek ever the glory and the dream, to look up with unquenchable faith in something ever more about to be. That was what any man could do and so be great. At midnight Adam paced under the palms. All seemed dim, gray, cool, spectral, rustling, whispering. The old familiar sounds were there, only rendered differently by his mood. Midnight was haunting. Somehow the desert with its mustering shadows, dark and vast and strange, resembled his soul and his destiny and the mystery of himself. How sweet the loneliness and solitude of the oasis! There under the palms he could walk and be himself, with only the eye of nature and of spirit on him in this final hour of his extremity. Happiness was not imperative. Self-indulgence was not essential to life. Adam realized he had done wonderful things, perhaps noble things, but nothing great. Perhaps all his agony had been preparation for this supreme ordeal. How saving and splendid it would be if out of his stultified youth, with its blinded love of brother and its weakness of will, if out of the bitter sting of infidelity and his fatal, tragic deed, if out of the long torture of hardship of the desert and its strife and its contact with souls as wild as his, How glorious it would be if out of this terrible tide of dark, contending years, so full of remorse and fear and endless atonement, there should rise a man who, trained now in the desert's ferocity to survive, should use that force to a noble aim, and, climbing beyond his nature, sacrifice himself to the old biblical law, a life for a life, and with faith in unknown future lend his spirit to the progress of the ages. Adam divined that he did not belong to himself. What he wanted for himself, selfishly, was not commensurable with the need of others in his life. He was concerned here with many ideals, the highest of which was sacrifice, that the evil of him should not go on. Since he had loved Ruth Virey, the whole value of life had shifted. Life was sweet, but no longer if he had to hide, no longer under the ban of crime. The stain must be washed away. By slow and gradual change, by torments innumerable, had he come to this realization. He had deceived himself by love of life, but the truth in him was the truth of the immortality of his soul, just as it was truth that he inherited instincts of the savage. Life was renewal. Every base, selfish man held back its spirituality. "No more! No more!" cried Adam, looking up. And in that cry he accepted the spirit of life, the mighty being that pulsated there in the darkness, the whispering voice of Jeannie's mother, the love of Ruth that never was to be his, the strange, desperate fights with his instincts, the stranger fight of his renunciation. He accepted these on faith as his idea of God. "I will give my life for my brothers," he said. "I will offer myself in punishment for my crime. I will pay with my body that I may save my soul." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Wanderer of the Wasteland by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. Adam lingered in his travel through the beautiful Palo Verde Valley, and at last reached the long swell of desert slope that led down to the Rio Colorado. Tranquil and sad was his gaze on the majestic river as it swirled red and sullen between its wide green borders toward the upflung wilderness of colored peaks he remembered so well. All day he strode behind his faithful burros, here on the high river bank where he could see the somber flood rolling to the south, and there low in the willow-shaded trail. And though he had an eye for the green, dry coverts and the wide, winding valley, he seemed to see most vividly the scenes of boyhood and of home. And the memory revived the love he had borne his brother Gerd. High on the grassy hill at the old village school, he was there once again, wild and gay, playing the games, tagging at the heels of his idol. The miles slipped by under his tireless stride. Hour by hour he had quickened his pace. And when sunset caught him with its call to camp, he could see the grand purple bulk of old Picacho looming in the sky. Twilight and dusk and night, and the lonely campfire. He heard the sullen gurgle of the river in the weeds, and he saw the trains of stars reflected along its swirling surface. A killdeer, most mournful of birds, pealed his plaintive, lonely cry. Across the blue-black sky gleamed a shooting star. The wind stirred in the leaves, gently and low, and fanned the glowing embers, and bore the white ashes away into the darkness. Shadows played from the flickering blaze, fantastic and weird, like dancing specters in the gloom. Adam watched the gleaming river rolling on to its grave in the gulf. Like all things, it died, was dispersed, and had rebirth in other climes. Then he watched the stars at their grand and blazing task. On the afternoon of the third day he turned under the red bluff into the basin of Picacho. Long the trail had been overgrown and dim, and cattle tracks were scarce. The wide willow and mesquite flat, with its groves of cottonwoods, had grown denser, wilder, no more criss-crossed by trails. Adam had slowed down now, and he skirted the edge of the thicket till he reached the bank of bronze rock that had flowed down from the peaks in ages past. The acacias, so pearly gray, softly green, and vividly scarlet, grew there just the same as long ago when he had plucked a flower for the dusky hair of Margarita. He welcomed sight of them, for they were of the past. And here, side by side, stood the crucifixion tree and the palo verde under which Margarita had told him their legends. The years had made no change that Adam could discern. The smoke tree and the green tree raised their delicate, exquisite, leafless foliage against the blue sky, beautiful and soft, hiding from the eye the harsh law of their desert nature. Adam tarried here. His wandering steps were nearing their end, and he gazed across the river at the wilderness of Arizona peaks. It seemed he knew every one. Had he seen them yesterday or long ago? The sculptured turrets of Picacho were taking on a crown of gold, and from the sheer, ragged bluffs of the purple massed shadows and hazes and rays were streaming down into the valley. One golden streak slanted from the wind-worn hole in the rim. Solemn and noble the castled mountain towered in the sky. In its lonely grandeur there was strength. One moment longer Adam watched and listened, absorbing the color and glory and wildness, stung to the depths of his heart by his farewell to loneliness. He retrograded one last instant to the savage who sensed but did not think. He thrilled to the old, mysterious, fading instinct. Then, as in answer to a sonorous call in his ear, he measured slow and laboring strides through the aisles to the river. His burros scratched their packs on the thorny mesquites to get down to the arrowweed and willow. Where once had been open bank, now all was green, except for a narrow sandy aisle. The dock was gone. A sunken barge lay on a bar, and moored to its end were two leaky skiffs. Traffic and trade had departed from the river landing. Adam remembered a prospector had told him that the mill had been moved from the river up to the mine under the peak. So now, he thought, supplies and traffic must come and go by way of Yuma. He drove his burros down the sandy aisle. A glimpse of an old adobe wall, gray through the mesquites, stopped his heart. He went on. The house of Arianas was a roofless ruin, the vacant windows and doors staring darkly, the walls crumbling to the sands. The shed where Adam had slept was now half hidden by mesquites. The octalia poles were bleached and rotten, and the brush was gone from the roof, but the sandy floor looked as clean and white as the day Adam had spread his blankets there. 14 years. Silent he stood, and the low, mournful wind was a knell. The past could never be undone. He went back to the lane and to the open. Old stone walls were all that appeared left of houses he expected to see. Over the trees, far up the slope, he espied the ruins of the dismantled mill. Unreal it looked there, out of place, marring the majestic sweep of the slope. His keen desert nostrils detected smoke before he saw blue columns rising through the green. He passed a plot of sand-mounded graves. Had they been there? How fierce a pang pierced his heart! Rude stones marking graves, and on one a single wooden cross, crude and weathered, slanted away. Adam peered low at the lettering, M.A., and swiftly he swung erect. There was a cluster of houses farther on, low and squat, a few of them new, but most of them Adam remembered. A post-office sign marked this village of Picacho. The stone-fronted store looked just the same, and the loungers there might never have moved from their tracks in 14 years, but the faces were strange. A lean old man, gray and peaked, detached himself from the group and tottered toward Adam with his cane in the sand. "Wall, stranger, howdy. You down from upriver?" His voice twanged a chord of memory. Maryvale. Slowly the tide of emotion rose in Adam's breast. He peered down into the gray old face, with its narrow, half-shut eyes and its sunken cheeks. Yes, it was Merivale. "Howdy, friend," replied Adam. "Yes, I come from up the river." "Strange in these parts, I reckon." "Yes, but I was here years ago." "I knowed you was strange because you come in by the river. Travelers nowadays go round the mountain. Prospectors never come any more. The glory of Picacho has faded." "Aren't they working the mill?" queried Adam quickly. "Ha, ha! The mill will never grind with ore that is gone. No work these last 5 years. The mill has rusted out, fallen to ruin, and the gold of old Picacho is gone. But, stranger, she hummed while she lasted. Millions in gold, millions in gold." He wagged his lean old head and chuckled. "I knew a man here once by the name of Arianus. What has become of him?" "Arianus? Well, I do recollect him. I was watchman at the mill, and he was boss of the gang. His daughter was knifed by a greaser named Felix. Arianus left here these 10 years ago, and he's never been back." "His daughter? Is that her grave back there, the sunken mound of sand, with the wooden cross?" "I reckon that's Margarita's grave. She was a pretty wench, mad about men, and there's some who said she got her just deserts." The broad river gleamed yellow through the breaks in the mesquites. Ponderous and swirling, it glided on round the bend. Adam's gaze then sought the peak. The vast, stormy purple mass, like a mountain of cloud, shone with sunset crown of silver. Somewhere near, hidden by the trees, a Mexican broke the stillness with song, wild, sensuous, Spanish love, in its haunting melody. "I knew another man here," began Adam, with the words a sonorous knell in his ear. "His name was Collishaw. What's become of him?" "Collishaw? Never will forget him," declared the old man grimly. "Last I heard he was cheating Injuns out of water rights over here at Walder's, and still looking for somebody to hang. Ha ha! That Collishaw was a Texas sheriff." Suddenly Adam bent lower, so that his face was on a level with Merivale's. "Don't you recognize me?" "Well, I sure don't, stranger," declared the other. "I've been nigh 50 years in the West and never seen your like yet. If I had, I'd never forgot." "Merivale, do you remember a lad who shot off your fishing line one day? Do you remember how you took interest in him, told him of Western ways, that he must be a man?" "Sure, I remember that lad," exclaimed Merivale bluntly. "He was old, but he was still keen. How'd you know about him?" "I'm Adam Larey." The old man's eyes grew piercing. Intensely he gazed, bending closer, strong and thrilling now, with the zest of earlier experience sharp in his expression. "I know you now. It's Adam. I'd knowed them eyes among 1,000, if only I'd looked. Eagle's eyes, Adam, once seen, never forgot. And look at the giant of him. Why, you make me feel young again. Adam, lad, I ain't never forgot ye, never. Shake hands with old Merivale." Agitated, with tremulous voice and shaking hands, he grasped Adam, almost embracing him, his gray old face alight with gladness. "It's good to see you, Merivale, to learn you've not forgotten me all these years. Lad, you was like my own. But who'd ever know you now? You've white hair, Adam, and I see the desert in your face. Old friend, did you ever hear of Wansfell?" "Wansfell? You mean that wanderer the prospectors tell about?" "Sure, I've been hearing tales of him these many years." "I am Wansfell," replied Adam. "So help me God! Wansfell! You, Adam, the kindly lad. Didn't I tell you what a hell of a man you'd be when you grew up?" Adam drew Merivale aside from the curiously gathering loungers. "Old friend, you are responsible for Wansfell. And now, before I go, I want you to take me to my brother's grave." Merivale stared. "What?" he ejaculated, and again his keen old eyes searched Adam's. "Yes, "The grave of my brother Gerd," whispered Adam. "Say, man, you think Gerd Larey's buried here? That's why you come back?" Astonishment seemed to dominate Maryvale, to hold in check other emotions. "My friend," replied Adam, "I came to see his grave, to make my peace with him and God, and to give myself up to the law." "Give yourself up to the law?" gasped Maryvale. "Have you gone desert mad?" "No, I'm in my right mind," returned Adam patiently. "I owe it to my conscience, Maryvale. 14 years of torture. Any punishment I may suffer here, compared with those long years, will be as nothing. It will be happiness to give myself up." Maryvale's lean jaw quivered as the astonishment and concern left his face. A light of divination began to dawn there. "But what do you want to give yourself up for?" he demanded. "I told you, my conscience, my need to stand right with myself, to pay." What did you do? What for?" "Old friend, you've grown thick of wits," rejoined Adam, "because of my crime." "And what was that, Adam Larey?" queried Maryvale sharply. "The crime of Cain," replied Adam sadly. "Come, friend, take me to my brother's grave." Maryvale seemed galvanized from age to youth. "Your brother's grave? Gerd Larey's grave? By heaven, I wish I could take you to it. Adam, you're out of your head. You're desert mad. Bless you, lad, you've made a terrible mistake. You're not what you think you are. You've hid in the desert 14 years. You've gone through hell. You've become Wansfell, all for nothing. My God, to think of that! Adam, you're no murderer. Your brother is not dead. He wasn't even bad hurt. No, no, Gerd Larey's alive, alive, alive." End of chapter 30. End of Wanderer of the Wasteland by Zane Grey.